Do this. Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast. In today's episode, you may just learn something that could save your life or the life of a loved one. For decades now, we've heard nothing but grim news when it comes to one of the top causes of death, Alzheimer's disease. According to our medical system, there is no cure for Alzheimer's. Well, my guest today says and proves otherwise. Dr. Dale Bredesen is an internationally recognized expert in the mechanisms of neurodegenerative diseases. Dr. Bredesen's career has been guided by a simple idea that Alzheimer's as we know it is not just preventable, but reversible. Dr. Bredesen earned his MD from Duke University Medical Center and served as chief resident in neurology at the University of California, San Francisco, before joining the Nobel laureate this is a really hard words to say, Prussener's laboratory at UCSF, that's a mouthful, as an NIH postdoctoral fellow. He held faculty positions at UCSF, UCLA, and the University of California, San Diego. Dr. Bredesen also directed the program on aging at the Burnham Institute before joining the Buck Institute in 1998 as founding president and CEO. Dr. Bredesen is a prodigious innovator in medicine with over 30 patents to his name. Notably, he put much of his findings and research into the 2017 New York Times bestseller, The End of Alzheimer's. So, welcome, Dr. Bredesen.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks for having me.
You've got some stuff backing you up. I actually tried to shorten your bio because I was like, okay, we're just going to try and tuck this in a little bit. And I was like, no, you just can't. This stuff is super important. You've got some amazing degree, everything behind you to back you up. And I think that that's important for our listeners to hear. You're not just coming out of the woodwork going, oh, here's my solution to Alzheimer's. You've put some time into this, haven't you?
Yeah, so we had 30 years in the laboratory looking at what drives the phenomenon of neurodegeneration. Why do brain cells die? It's an incredibly common problem. Alzheimer's has now become the third leading cause of death in the United States, for example. And it is a $1 trillion global health problem. And so it's been the area, as you know, of greatest biomedical therapeutic failure. Yeah. As people say, everybody knows a cancer survivor, no one knows an Alzheimer's survivor. Yeah. Well, now we have the first survivors, and we have hundreds of them. And so we're hearing again and again about wonderful results based on going after the biochemistry, what actually drives the process.
So I was wrong there. I said the sixth leading cause, and it's the third. And there's a big difference as well between women getting it and men, isn't there?
Yes. It's almost 2 to 1. So about 65% of people with Alzheimer's are women. So this is, as Maria Shriver has pointed out repeatedly, this is a woman-centric disease. And of course, Parkinson's, other way around, it's about 1.8 men to 1 woman. So Alzheimer's is indeed a disease that is more focused on women. About 60% of the caregivers are also women. So it really takes a disproportionate toll on women.
Yeah. So I wanted to have you on, not just because I think that the work you've done is literally life-saving and is going to change the face of medicine when it comes to Alzheimer's. I really believe that. And I want to share that with my audience because I do believe it could save their life or someone they love. My personal reasons for having you on too, though, are the fact that my grandpa died from Alzheimer's, and I've watched my mom, who's in her 60s, now worrying about it. I don't think she's got it, but she worries about getting it. And hitting my perimenopausal years, my memory started to just not be the same. And so I've had it in the back of my head for probably 2 years now of, I wonder if I'm going to get Alzheimer's. And it's funny because I don't think am I going to get heart disease? Am I going to get cancer? But Alzheimer's just kept picking away at me, this intuitive feeling of what if? And I kept thinking, I got to get genetic testing. I remember I asked my mom, I said, did you do genetic testing? Oh no, I'm not going to do that. I'll worry forever then if I'm going to get it. And every time I forget something, I'm going to think, oh my gosh, it's the Alzheimer's. And then I started to look into it myself and found you in your podcast. And then I kept thinking, okay, now I really need to get it tested because it's preventable. And I just kept putting it on the back burner. And then just recently, I had the CEO of DNA Power. I don't know if you've heard of them, but it's a genetic testing company up here in
Yeah.
Canada, actually out of Vancouver. And she got a hold of me and said, I will give you all 4 of our test kits if I can come on your podcast and kind of share the power of knowing your DNA when it comes to health and
Yeah.
fitness and diet. And I was like, yes, it was like a $700 test. Sure, great. And I'm
Yeah.
thinking to myself, all I care about is testing that Alzheimer's gene. And sure enough, I've got a copy of the ApoE4 like I knew I would. And then that just sent me on, like, I immediately got your book and just started listening to every podcast that you've been on. And it gave me hope. And I had to phone my mom and say, Mom, you gotta pay attention to this. You can't ignore it. So I'm sure, Dr. Bredesen, you probably hear this all the time of, I don't want to find out because
Right.
there is no cure.
Yes, that's such an important point you bring up. And, we're so used to hearing from Silicon Valley about Facebook, Twitter, all these new things, all these disruptions of our older technology. And yet in medicine, it's the opposite. Medicine is all about tradition and permission, and this is what we do. And unfortunately, for diseases where there hasn't been anything, it makes it much harder to take a step forward. So in fact, everything that we're doing now in Alzheimer's and in standard of care is backwards. There are over 80 million people in North America who have a single copy of the ApoE gene, and well over 7 million who have 2 copies. If you have 0 copies, your chance during your lifetime about 9%. It's not 0, but it's not terribly high. If you have a single copy, your chance during your lifetime of developing Alzheimer's about 30%. And if you have 2 copies, it's well over 50%. So we should all know this. And in fact, this old idea, don't find out, we don't want to know because there's nothing we can do, it's just backwards from that. And in fact, everybody should find out. We recommend anyone who's 45 years of age or older, and especially if there's any family history, should get checked and should get on prevention.
Yeah,
And you can
absolutely.
pretty much ensure that if you do all the right things, you hit the right biochemical markers, then you're going to do just fine. And this is what we're seeing again and again and again. And the reality is, now that we understand more about the mechanisms of this disease, we can make Alzheimer's a rare disease, and it should be a rare disease. And you think about those scourges, in the past, people worried about leprosy and they're worried about polio and smallpox and things like this. These are all scourges of the past. We can now make Alzheimer's a scourge of the past, and that's the way it should be.
Yeah.
So, your generation really should be the first one not to worry about this. This has been, in the last 15 years, it has been the #1 concern of aging individuals, losing their mind, losing their brain power. And so there's a tremendous amount we can do. We've always been told the armamentarium is 0. In fact, the armamentarium is huge. You mentioned insulin resistance. Insulin resistance, critical. Lipid transport and handling, inflammatory illness, various pathogens that we can treat, specific toxins. I have been shocked, as a researcher, I have been shocked to see how frequently specific toxins, be they metallotoxins, organic toxins, or biotoxins, how frequently they contribute to cognitive decline.
Yeah.
And these are all addressable. So this disease where people keep telling you, we have no idea why you get this. No, we have a very good idea now, and there's a lot we can do about it. And you're starting to see people talking about that. The AARP just recently mentioned it. Maybe this is something that can be preventable, whereas the old claim was nothing you could prevent or reverse or delay even. And that's just not the case. So we're seeing it again and again. There are thousands of people now on the protocol we developed. And we have some wonderful, wonderful stories of people going back to work. I just had a great story the other day, a guy getting his driver's license back.
Wow.
And going back to being able to have his life and drive and all this sort of stuff. By the way, there's a wonderful assisted living facility called Marama that is now in San Diego. It's the first one that uses this protocol to try to get people back out. I mean, in the past, when you go to assisted living, there's only one direction to go. So one of the people who came in said, oh, I'm so excited, I'm planning what I'm going to do when I'm now released. And so it's a new era, and we need to embrace that, and we need to learn what's going to be best for each person and get involved. There is so much. If someone had told you, hey, Karen, don't worry, you can think about heart disease after you have your first heart attack, you'd say, what kind of a lousy doctor are you? This is exactly what people say, well, I'm not going to look into this. And we need to look into it. And there's a tremendous amount you can do.
Yeah. Your approach is considered functional medicine. And that is not your background, is it? Like you said prior to us starting the recording, you were like, I did not plan to go into functional medicine, but this is what the research shows us.
Right. That's been a huge surprise to me. So I trained in very classical medicine and very classical science, and it was all about, you write the prescription, you figure out what the diagnosis is. Is it Alzheimer's? Is it Lewy body? Is it frontotemporal? Whatever. You write a prescription, and of course, in those diseases, the prescription doesn't work very well at all. And then you just say, I'm so sorry, we don't know how to deal with this. We don't know what this is all about. And that's why I went back to the laboratory 30 years ago to say, could we understand, if we could understand the fundamental nature of this process at the molecular level and the cellular level, maybe we could actually address it. And that's exactly what we found. What we found is that at the heart of this cognitive decline is a molecule called APP. And we always think about the amyloid in the brains of people with Alzheimer's disease. Well, the amyloid comes from a parent molecule that's called APP that sits in your neurons and other cells as well, but especially prevalent in your neurons and especially near the synapses. And what's interesting about this molecule, it's like a molecular switch. And so what it does when things are good, you've got enough nutrients, you've got enough hormones, you've got enough trophic factors, there's not a lot of inflammation going on, very much like, you're in a country and things are good, you're going to grow, you're going to make new bridges and you're going to make new partners and all this sort of stuff. And so your APP then, in that case, gets cut at one site and produces two pieces, two peptides, one that goes outside the cell, one that goes inside. And what they do is they tell the cell, hey, things are good. We're going to grow. We're going to make new synapses, literally make and store new memories. But when things are bad, you're on the other side. You've got ongoing inflammation. You've got toxin exposure. You've got low nutrients, low hormones, all these things. The insulin resistance that you mentioned earlier, one of the most common players in all this. You've got exposure to mycotoxins or high mercury levels, things like that. The same molecule now gets cut at 3 different sites and gives 4 pieces that all say retreat, retreat. Things are not going well. And so what's amazing about this is all part of a system in your brain that is recognizing insults, recognizing danger, pathogens. In the new book coming up, which is going to be out in August, I likened this to being the president of my brainistan. So if you're the president of my brainistan, and things are going poorly, you're saying, okay, pull back. And the amyloid has turned out to be an antimicrobial. And this was shown by Robert Moyer. Yeah, this was shown by Robert Moyer and Rudy Tanzi at Harvard a number of years ago. So this stuff that we have vilified over the years is in fact your response to insults. So it's not that we want to get rid of your response, we want to get rid of the insults. And to do that, we need to figure out what they are. So again, I recommend everybody 45 or older, please get checked out. We call this, just like everyone knows, when you turn 50, you get a colonoscopy, okay? And actually my wife and I, when we turned 50, we went on Valentine's Day and had his and hers, just because we both hated the idea of like, let's just get this over with. And so, the same thing, if you're 45 or older, please get a cognoscopy. It's pretty straightforward to do. You can actually now do this directly, and you'll get a series of lab values. There aren't lab values that typically that your doctor is going to be doing, but they're the critical ones to determine whether, in fact, you are at risk for cognitive decline. And of course, they include what you had mentioned, to know this, and you should know. And in fact, there are things you can do. You probably know this wonderful website called apoe4.info, which gives tremendous information, started by Julie G., who actually wrote this next book with me
Oh,
and
wow.
with my wife, Aida, who is a physician. And so, we're starting to realize this is really about changing the way we think about this and making it so that nobody gets this illness.
Yeah. So before we kind of get, because I want to hear kind of what the cognoscopy, I know, but I want my
Right.
listeners to kind of hear what
Sure.
some of that consists of and where to go and get that from. But
Right.
first, I'd love for you to go into what you call the subtypes of Alzheimer's, because we
Yeah.
used to think that, there's just probably one cause, which is the amyloid plaques, not sure
Right.
why, that was causing this Alzheimer's. Like you said, this is our own body protecting ourselves. Like our body's so smart, it's crazy, but it's protecting from these biotoxins and other things. So talk about the subtypes, because our listeners, I mean, we're all going through perimenopause, menopause, we're losing our memory. There's tons of people listening that have insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, that are they don't realize that they could be very susceptible to getting Alzheimer's disease.
Absolutely. And no surprise, the earlier you get it, the earlier that you find out the problem, the earlier in the course, the easier it is to fix. And I should say, we just got some wonderful data back on a group of people who were just at the very minimal symptoms, just saying, yeah, my memory's not quite what it was. And they all just had such great improvement. Now, as people go along and they have early Alzheimer's, it's harder. We do see improvement, but it's harder to get it. And then the people who are late, occasionally someone will get improvement, but it's much, much harder. So no surprise, as with any chronic illness, just like cancer, don't wait. You want to get in as early as possible. And it's easier and you get a more complete response. So absolutely, this is critical. Now, when we started looking at this, we found out, hey, wait a minute, there are different pathways. You're right, they all end in amyloid. But it turns out, as I mentioned, this is a protector. It's protecting you from insults. So here's a simple example. If you have pathogenic bacteria in your mouth, P. gingivalis is the most well-known, but there are several others, T. denticola and F. nucleatum and so forth and so on. These can actually get into your brain.
Gum
And
disease, can we just call it that?
gum disease, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So periodontitis, exactly, good point. So yeah, what used to be years and years ago called pyorrhea and then was later called periodontitis. Yes, these things, and in fact, there's something you can do about it. There's a test called oral DNA that actually looks for these pathogens. And there's a wonderful there's actually a wonderful toothpaste called dental Sidon that can actually kill these things. So good thing. And again, the old idea was we want to sterilize your mouth, give you all sorts of things that kill. Well, no, now we know there's a microbiome, right? So we want the good guys. We don't want the bad guys.
Right.
And when we have too many bad guys and not enough good guys, we want to change that balance. Same for your gut, same for your mouth, same for multiple areas on your body. So what we found is that there are people that have Alzheimer's, and the predominant problem is inflammation, whether it's from the P. gingivalis, whether it's from the herpes simplex, whether it's from Lyme disease, on and on and on, lots of reasons. It's often because of a poor diet and a leaky gut and things like that. Anything that drives systemic inflammation. So we call that type 1 or inflammatory or hot Alzheimer's. Then there's type 2, very different story. And that is where you don't have enough support. So you don't have enough growth factor. You don't have enough hormone support. You don't have enough nutrient support. So you literally have to downsize because you can't afford. You're keeping lots and lots of synapses, about 1 quadrillion, almost 1 quadrillion synapses in your brain.
Wow.
You're keeping those supported. And as things pull back, you have an atrophic process, just as you might in your skin, just as you might in other areas. So that's type 2 or atrophic or cold Alzheimer's. And then we found that there's one that's actually in the middle. It has some inflammation and it also has some atrophy. And that turns out to be glycotoxic. That turns out to be from insulin resistance and from glycotoxicity. As you know, glucose literally sticks on to very different proteins like hemoglobin. We measure it as hemoglobin A1C, but there are hundreds of proteins that get glycated. And so that can produce dysfunction and it can also produce inflammation. So you get the worst of both worlds there. So we call that glycotoxic or sweet Alzheimer's, type 1.5. And it's actually pretty easy to address. So if you know that that's the main problem, you can get after that and improve that. And then type 3 is a different thing, is toxic Alzheimer's. And as I mentioned, that can be from metallotoxins, it can be from organic toxins, it can be from biotoxins. Many people had no idea they're living in situations where there is mold that produces, and it's not all molds, but especially certain ones, Stachybotrys and Penicillium and Aspergillus and Chaetomium and Wallemia. Those are kind of the big 5 that can produce these toxins. And actually, one of the things these toxins can do is to cause dementia. And your body responds to them. So when we see these people, we can help get rid of these toxins. And in fact, they turn around and get better when you do that. But most doctors are not checking for this, and most people don't realize that's one of the causes. So that's type 3 or toxic. Type 4 is vascular, where vascular component is the main thing. And then type 5 is traumatic, where people have had head injury. That increases your risk for Alzheimer's disease. Of course, also for chronic traumatic encephalopathy. So those are the major, the 6 ones, 5 plus the 1 and 1.5. Yeah. And we do see people from all of those, and you don't want to attack them all the same way. No surprise. You want to do the appropriate thing for each of those.
Yeah. Let's jump back to the type 2, the hormone one.
Yeah. Yes.
Because as we age, as women, we definitely notice this big drop in our memory function. And I mean, this happens to everybody. So yes. So does that mean that all of us have this, susceptibility then to Alzheimer's because we lose our hormones?
Well, that's a really good point. And years ago, people tried estradiol as a potential treatment for Alzheimer's. And they ultimately decided it doesn't seem to help enough people enough of the time. Well, again, it's because they didn't understand. They were trying to treat all the types with the same thing. And it doesn't really make sense. The simple fact that we're trying to point out here is that to treat an illness, you want to find out what's driving it. And that's more true in Alzheimer's than even in other diseases. Again, imagine that you got, you got COVID-19 and someone's trying to treat you for tuberculosis. I mean, it just makes no sense. And so, in fact, you need to know what's driving the process. For many people, you're absolutely right, especially the ones who are coming on around the time of menopause or perimenopause, or within a few years after menopause. That loss, especially if it's a rapid loss, the people who have the most trouble are the ones who do this. And so there were some nice papers written out of the Mayo Clinic a number of years ago, looking at women who had had hysterectomies at the age of 40 or younger without hormone replacement, and they doubled their risk for Alzheimer's disease. So it's a big impact. This is also probably part of the reason why men, although we of course also have memory problems, but in fact, it is less common to get Alzheimer's, probably in part because when we have andropause, we go down over years like this, whereas menopause often. Now, in some women, it's not so steep, but in some women, it is steeper. And that seems to be more of a risk. So, obviously, this is a huge area of controversy because, of course, having bioidentical hormone replacement therapy, so-called BHRT, has its own issues. And yet, for cognition, it does seem to be helpful. And so we encourage people, especially if there are any changes. And I should say, when I was training way back in the 80s, we never saw people in their 50s with Alzheimer's disease, unless it was the rare familial cases that tend to get this earlier. Less than 5% of Alzheimer's is familial. So we never saw this in a sporadic, the 95% type. And yet it's one of the most common things we see now, women in their 50s developing Alzheimer's. And it's not just hormonally related. In these people, it's also from exposure to toxins, and especially the ones who have a certain set of symptoms. The toxic type, the type 3, actually looks different than the others. They tend to start not so much with just memory loss. They tend to start with so-called executive dysfunction, problems with organization, often problems with calculation. They'll often say, oh my gosh, I can't figure out a tip anymore, or I can't pay bills anymore. things like that. They often will have trouble with word finding. They'll often have trouble with recognition of shapes. So often things that are so-called non-amnestic presentations. Now, some also have the amnestic presentations, especially if they also have ApoE4, but many don't. And often people will have depression as part of this. And so they'll be treated for depression, not realizing this is not just depression. This is incipient Alzheimer's disease.
Right. Is there an easy way to kind of explain the effects of estrogen in our brain? Like, why is it that one in particular is so important? I know there's others too, DHEA and cortisol you talk about in your book, and thyroid. Are you able to see why that is? Like, what is it doing in our brain?
Yeah, that's a great point. So, and estradiol probably the most important of all of these. So what happens is estradiol, as you know, binds to its receptor, and there are a couple of receptors, but it binds to a receptor, and this receptor then goes from the cytoplasm of the cells outside the nucleus into the nucleus, and it interacts with hundreds of genes. So it is literally a major player in terms of telling your cells what to do. And it's changing everything from the ability to make and store memories, to the ability to respond to stress, to the ability to respond to inflammation, all these sorts of things. So many, many things. And I should mention another one that's kind of similar that does the same thing is vitamin D. Vitamin D has an impact on over 900 different genes.
Wow.
So these are master regulators. It's a little bit like, changing your whole program. It's not just changing one thing, you're changing your whole program. And so this is why estradiol, which by the way has receptors in your brain. So your brain does respond directly to estradiol as well as to other hormones. And so it is, you're right, it's a striking effect. And study after study after study shows that this is important for optimal cognition. Now, as you know, there was the big WHI that came out years ago, and everyone said, oh my gosh, this is bad.
Estrogen's bad.
Yes.
It's not bad, everyone.
Yeah, and again, I don't know if you've had Dr. Anne Hathaway on your podcast or not.
I haven't yet, but I just had Dr. Mock Seibel, who wrote The Estrogen Window.
Yeah,
and he talks lots about it. Yeah, amazing. Yeah.
So this is, and Anna's a real expert as well.
Yeah, she is.
These are important. And as she points out, the bad actor in the WHI was the synthetic progesterone. Yeah. That seems to be the thing that really has a problem. And again and again and again in other studies with estradiol, there have been shown to be improvements. And there was a wonderful study out of Stanford that showed very clear improvements with estradiol. And as you said, again, you want to get the earlier, the better.
Yeah.
You want to get in there at the time of menopause and not be waiting 10, 20, 30 years down the road. Having said that, there are people who have been even 10, 15 years down the road where they do get some improvement. And again, it just depends on receptor status, it depends on your response, and a number of other factors. But again, you have to remember, this is a completely different way to think about medicine now. This is 21st century medicine. This is precision medicine. It doesn't say, oh, people are just a prescription pad. You just write a medicine and they're going to be fine. That's not the way the human body works. It's kind of silly that we ever thought that the human body would work that way. This is like dealing with an orchestra. You have the violins and you have the woodwinds and you have the timpani and you have all these things. You have got to adjust these all. And people who are trying to go after the next drug, and yeah, drugs are going to be great on the backbone of the whole program. But it's a little bit like saying we continue to search for that one instrument that makes the orchestra. No, that's not the way orchestras work. And so what we have to do when we look at what's driving this is we look at all the things that may be creating inflammation. We look at all the things that are atrophic. We look at the glycotoxicity. We look at the different toxins. And then from that, we actually developed a computer-based algorithm that says, okay, here are the things that are actually driving this. Let's attack them all in your case. And when you attack the different ones, you're now resetting the whole program. And this is when people do the best.
Mm-hmm. I talk a lot about finding your weight loss code in my practice and on my podcast. And when I say that, I really mean very much what you're talking about, which is there is no one magic pill. And there's a ton of Band-Aids out there, but you really need to collectively find all of these little pieces these numbers, codes, puzzle pieces, however you want to see it, that fit together for you. And each one of us is going to be different. And your protocol is very much like that. It's like you need to look at all of these pieces that could be a factor, and just basically you just start checking them off. Like, okay, well, I'm going to bring this in because this sounds like me. And that's what I did when I read the book. I was like, okay, I've got the diet down for sure. The hormone piece, probably I need to work on that one a little bit more than I already do. But, I just started to take these little things that I thought, okay, this does apply to me. And I think that if people could approach your program with that open mind going, okay, there's going to be a lot of stuff in here, because there is.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that can contribute to Alzheimer's, and there's many different things that you can put into place here. But just to start ticking them off and going, okay, I'm going to take this. And I know you've got stories in there from patients that's what they did. Like at the end, you give this story of a woman who she wasn't doing everything you said,
Right.
but it was working for her. And she was able to reverse her symptoms. She's still doing awesome. And I think that that's really key for people to hear, is that you don't have to do everything, but you want to start to see what applies to you.
That's exactly right. So, there's a threshold. And again, no different than cardiovascular disease.
Right.
As Dr. Dean Ornish found 35 years ago, many of us are putting down plaque in our arteries, and it's getting worse and worse. When we start doing the right things, we actually start picking it up again. So there's this threshold. This is the same story. It's a little more complicated because it's the brain and you're making synapses, and there are many things. We usually tell people, imagine that you have a roof with 36 holes in it.
Yes.
A drug is going to be a wonderful patch for one hole, but we want to get at the other holes. The good news is when you get over that threshold, and it may only be 5 or 10, depends, then everything else snaps shut. And so now you're in good shape. You're on the right side. So one of the things we're working on now, as we continue to try to refine this and make it more and more effective, is to determine for each person, what are the priorities? Okay, maybe you don't need to do 36 different things. Even if you do 1 or 2, that's a beginner. Here we can tell you, here are the top 5. So please, for example, please get yourself into insulin sensitivity. Get yourself into mild ketosis. Do appropriate fasting when that is part of the issue. Let's address your inflammatory status. Let's make sure you resolve that inflammation. And with just those few things, that may be enough for you to turn it around. So you have to kind of, play with it a little and see, okay, but again, even doing a few things is far better than doing nothing. Because many of us are driving ourselves into Alzheimer's by the things we're doing every day, by the exposures we have every day, by the ongoing inflammation that we're unaware of. All these things are critical.
Mm-hmm. I think exposure is a big one that people don't, not enough people go down that road of, I know that it took me a very long time to go down that road of, is there maybe something underlying some of these health problems, and digging deeper? And I remember thinking, oh, well, I don't have heavy metal toxicity, and I've never had a feeling in my life. Where would I be exposed to things like mercury? I don't eat big fish. I just thought, no. And then as I started to dig and dig, and I thought, you know what, I'm just going to rule it out. I'm going to go get a heavy metal test done and just rule it out. And I had moderately high levels of mercury, and I off the chart levels of lead. It was as high as it could possibly go with lead. And I'm like, what? How could this possibly be? And it just, brought me into that world of these toxins that you're talking about. So, because I think people hear when you say biotoxins, they don't really understand what that means as far as mold. Mold, you could be exposed to mold when you were a kid, and it can lie dormant in your system until a stressful event can actually make it come out and cause health problems. That can happen to so many people can be exposed to mold and they have no idea. So many people like me, I said, I've got no mercury fillings, but I was vaccinated. My mom was full of mercury, which then gets passed down into the placenta, apparently into the fetus. So could you talk a little to that? Like, how often are you seeing that it's these biotoxins and these heavy metals that are a big contributing factor?
Yeah, I don't know. Did you see the film Dark Waters with Mark Ruffalo and Anne Hathaway?
No.
So wonderful film that came out a few months ago, and it was about the DuPont and Teflon and the
I saw the
unfortunate,
preview.
exactly, And it was, it was just the fact that when you make this stuff, you've got a product, a PFOA, which is a carbon-based toxin. And this stuff was stuck in barrels and sludge was put in the ground and all these things. And people didn't realize that they were exposed to this stuff for years. And of course, it ended up giving people all sorts of different cancers and things like that. So we were looking at this the other night, and my daughter was looking and saying, "Oh my God," who's a brain health coach actually, was looking and saying, "Oh my gosh, I had no idea that all of us have been exposed." It turns out that most people now, 99% of people have measurable blood levels of this PFOA. So, we've all had some exposure. Now, the people who had most exposure had major problems, but all of us have some. And of course, we're now hearing about microplastics that are in fish and that are, everywhere now. So the surprise to us was that the majority of people who have cognitive decline do indeed have some significant degree of exposure. And so detox is going to be, for the future, is going to be a critical part of the reversal of cognitive decline. And all of us can do some basic things for detox. Some of the basics like, having filtered water and having a high fiber diet, and doing saunas and just basic detox. But then beyond that, you can also do specific things. And, you should know, good idea to know your glutathione level, good idea to know that you've got enough glutathione. Think about taking some things with sulforaphanes and things like that. These are all helpful for detox. So the big surprise was that, in fact, these exposures are present in more than half of the people with cognitive decline. And as you indicated, mercury is the big one when it comes to metals. The other metals can help to push you over because they do reduce your ability to fight the toxins. But mercury is the one that actually gives you something that looks identical to Alzheimer's disease. So it is a cause of Alzheimer's, not in too many people, but in some. So it's good to know both your inorganic mercury, which, as you said, you get that from your amalgams. And on the other hand, you also want to know your organic mercury, which is what you get from eating seafood. Right. And you can, in fact, just decrease. You may have to decrease your seafood for a few months to get that back down. Now, of course, seafood has all sorts of good things. So, this is not just a black and white. You have to kind of adjust depending on your intake. But again, there are things you can do about this. And then organic toxins, formaldehyde, toluene, things like this that come up again and again and again. A recent example of someone who had been exposed to acrolein, which is in some herbicides. Wow. It's also present when you have incompletely combusted material. So it can be in fried foods. It can also be from your car exhaust. So, and this is another thing that can contribute to neurotoxicity and cognitive decline. And then, of course, the one that people are wondering about is glyphosate from Roundup. Yeah. That's another issue. And, no question, people are beginning to see neurotoxicity already. As you know, it's been pointed out that this increases your risk for certain kinds of lymphomas. But it's also turning out that it's very likely to be a toxin with respect to cognitive decline, or at least neurodegeneration. And then beyond the organics, of course, the biotoxins. And these are things that are made by organisms. And as I mentioned, the most common is the things made by molds. But there are others. Cyanobacteria, for example, make biotoxins. And there are others like that, other various bacteria. The molds, they're really trying to protect themselves. So molds grow more slowly than bacteria. So they are fighting. By the way, that's how we got penicillin, 1929, right. Came from this discovery that, oh my gosh, molds can actually damage bacteria. When you've got them both growing on the plate, you see this big clear area where the mold cleared out the bacteria. So the molds are fighting with the bacteria. And by the way, they're also fighting with us. And so they elaborate these toxins, some of which are neurotoxins, some of which are immunotoxins, some of which are renal toxins. I mean, these things are nasty. Unfortunately, they can be associated with cognitive decline. And I can't tell you now how many stories we've heard when we say, oh yeah, your house actually is filled with this stuff and is making these mycotoxins. Let's get rid of these things. You can find them in a simple urine test. Yep. And people will say, Yeah, I've had this mold in my house, which I didn't know it meant anything. And by the way, I've had chronic sinusitis, and my doctor just said, oh, don't know where that came from. And also, you'll find other members of the family will have other things. So they'll say, oh, yeah, I didn't realize, my son over here has autism, my
Right.
husband has lung disease, and I have cognitive decline. Well, yeah, you're all exposed to that. And we had actually one doctor who was a little skeptical about this. His wife had cognitive decline, was diagnosed as having Alzheimer's by an outside hospital. And we said, yeah, this is a significant problem for her. He said, really? Mold can do that? And then he actually started getting lung disease, and it turned out his was from the same mold
Wow.
species. So it's actually, there's not enough understood about
No,
this. These
there
are
really
literally
isn't.
dementogens. We're all hearing about carcinogens, but we don't hear enough about dementogens.
Yep. And what's interesting, Dale, is how many of these things, all these subtypes, all affect one another. Like lead and mercury can deplete your hormone levels, can make your thyroid go down, can make your reverse T3 go up. Insulin, there's a huge connection between insulin resistance and mercury
Yeah.
that it can actually contribute to it. Same with thyroid. And then, all of these things are all intertwined together as far as how they, if you get one thing, it's going to affect, and it's going to make it more probable that you get another type as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, for thousands of years, we've practiced medicine in such a way that we've tried to kind of oversimplify it. Okay, we're going to do one little thing. We're going to get right one
Here's your
little prescription,
Band-Aid.
one little medicine. And, in the 21st century, we're realizing that that's just not the way human beings work. Human beings are complicated. And, if you took this to an engineer and said, okay, here's this incredibly complex machine, the human organism, and it's got 3.3 billion base pairs of DNA. And that's the simplest thing because it's unidimensional. And you've got a foldome and an exposome and a microbiome and on and on and on. And now it's having trouble. And we're going to give you some data, serum sodium, serum potassium, a couple things like that. The engineer would say that's a joke. You have to have more understanding. This whole thing works together. And just as you said, here's a simple example. People who are low on progesterone aren't as good at detoxing. So that's a critical player in your detox apparatus. People who have, as we talked about earlier, who have glycotoxicity, get both the damage from the inflammation and they get the damage from the insulin resistance. Your cells are literally not responding as well to that insulin as they did before. So these things are all interdependent. And this is why it's so powerful to identify as many problems as possible and then start to patch each one of these things, because at some point, things now flip into a positive mode and you actually start seeing improvement.
Yeah. And I love the analogy of the 36 holes in the roof. And you got to go around and patch these holes. Let's talk about the cognoscopy and a little bit about your RECODE protocol and what it consists of.
Thank you. Yeah, so the cognoscopy, the idea is that we all need to know what is either giving us risk if we're asymptomatic or what is actually giving us some decline. And by the way, we see this all the time. Someone says, I'm here because I, of risk, I've got some in my family. And we start evaluating, we find out, oh yeah, you're already into the earliest stages. Thank goodness you came in now. It's much easier to fix things. So, there are a lot of people who believe they're there for prevention who are really there for reversal.
Wow.
So with a cognoscopy, it's pretty straightforward. There are three things that you want to know. Number one, there's a set of blood tests, and where they basically go with the 5 different types. So 1 through 5, it's 6 different types because there's a 1.5. So we want to know, what's your inflammatory status? What's your glycotoxicity status? What's your insulin resistance status? What's your atrophic status? Do you have enough support? What toxins have you been exposed to? How are your vessels looking? These are the critical things, and pretty straightforward to do. And as I say, you can actually do this now directly. You can go to mycognoscopy.com and get these tests directly. Second thing you want to know is you want to get a simple assessment of where you stand with your cognition. And you can do that easily, a number of ways to do it. We like to use CNS vital signs, but you can also do it with a MoCA score, that's Montreal Cognitive Assessment.
I did it this morning, Dr. Bredesen.
Great.
I passed, but I did it to myself, so I don't think.
Yeah. So yeah, you should have your significant other or whoever
Yes,
you
I
like
should. Yeah.
help you and check that out. Yeah, very good thing to do. As you know, the MoCA, as it's called, is not terribly sensitive. So we do see people all the time who are getting 28 on MoCA and they're already having problems. So yeah, so it's not as sensitive, but it's good for picking out MCI. So you go from asymptomatic to SCI, subjective cognitive impairment, to MCI, mild cognitive impairment, which is now when your tests are starting to show problems, to Alzheimer's disease. And so the good news, we have a long time that you can actually look at these. So we actually, the timing where we can make a big difference is about 20 years. So that's, again, I encourage
Wow.
everyone to get in as early as possible or get in for prevention. That's huge. So that's the second part of the cognoscopy. The third part is an MRI with volumetrics. And by the way, if you have no symptoms and you're doing well on your MoCA, you don't need an MRI.
Yeah.
I don't encourage people to get them. If you do have symptoms or you're having problems on your testing, then you do want to know, because you want to know, is there a stroke in there that has been missed? Are there other problems? And also you want to know your hippocampal volume. If you've got a shrunken hippocampus, that is a poorer prognostic sign. Get in earlier, do more. If you've got one that's not shrunken, it's a little less of an emergency. So again, the armamentarium is huge. With those three simple things, you can get an idea about your risk, or you can get an idea about what's causing your decline if that's already started. And there's a tremendous amount you can do about it.
Yeah.
So as you indicated, we did begin a protocol called RECODE. That's for reversal of cognitive decline. And by the way, we're now just finishing up PRECODE, prevention of cognitive decline, because many people said, can't we do something a little simpler if we truly have no problems at all? And the answer is yes. And so PRECODE, fewer tests, fewer things that you need to do because you're really in a prevention mode rather than a reversal mode. And you have to remember, for reversal, when we started this, it was a death sentence. So if you had it, that's it, it's over. And so, of course, we wanted to pull out all the stops. So we thought, okay, the research shows that there are these 36 holes that came from the mechanisms that lead to that difference that I mentioned earlier with APP. It does feed in with inflammation, and it does feed in with various pathogens. So you add up all these different little pieces that feed in, it's about 36 pieces. So, okay, we want to get you on the right side. And of course, we were throwing the kitchen sink at it. We were saying, look, is there anything? This has never been achieved before. And then people started turning around. We thought, okay, now we're on the right track. Now we can start looking at how to enhance it. We can start looking at, can we make it a little simpler? That sort of thing. So that's RECODE. And basically it addresses those very things. And we've now trained over 1,500 physicians in 10 different countries and all over the United States and Canada. We also have a new RECODE 2.0 that's going to be finished up and available online training in July. And I actually think, if anyone is a caregiver for someone with cognitive decline, I encourage them to take this, to look at, what are the things that could potentially be contributing. It's something that all of us could use to make things better for those. And we've had some amazing stories with people who are even late stage in nursing homes getting some improvement. Now, to be fair, it's harder. You have to do more, and it's less likely to improve. But I had an interesting email from a guy saying, why are you saying it's not as good for late? My wife had a MoCA score of 0. She's clearly improved. You shouldn't be telling us not to do this. So, okay, I hear you. But again, I encourage people to get in as early as possible for best results.
Yeah, I think that that's key. Even you can do so much from home. You can do DNA testing. Like, even that's just a great place to see if you've got the genetic SNP for it. Go see if you've got the ApoE4 like I did. And then you can build on top of that. But I think it's important. Now, your specific diet protocol is ketogenic, which I think is great.
Right.
Yeah.
So again, we looked at, we're agnostic. Anything that works, we want to do whatever we can, because this has been such a horrible illness for so many people. And so what it turns out, if you look at the biochemistry and what actually helps make the synapses and keep the synapses, it turns out the thing that works the best is what we've called KetoFlex 12-3. So this means, yes, mildly ketogenic. It is a plant-rich, and we say that in part because of the importance of fiber. And people laugh about fiber. Well, this stuff, improves your glycemic control. It helps you detox. It's just one thing. It improves your lipid profile, just one thing after another, improves your microbiome. It's amazing how important and helpful that is. And of course, many of us are too low. Our ancient ancestors had much more fiber than we did. And they didn't have to contend with all of these toxins that we now have to contend with. So that is called KetoFlex 12.3. It's plant-rich, mildly ketogenic. We want to get people up in the 1.0 to 4.0 millimolar beta-hydroxybutyrate, which is the major ketone body. And it is flexitarian. So, you can, and when we first mentioned flexitarian, actually I have to say, we didn't realize that the flexitarians say you have to eat meat. Okay, so what we're really saying is this is flexible. Yep. If you want to be a vegetarian, fine, you can do that as long as you make sure to keep your vitamin D and B12 and those sorts of things at optimal levels. Great, but you can also have some protein. Yeah, have some fish, have some meat, have some pastured chicken, have some grass-fed beef. All these things are fine, but you want to shoot for it's about a 70-15-15 or so. So about 70% of calories from good fats, avocados and all oils and things like that. And yeah, meat's great. About 15% or so on the protein and about 15% or so on the carbohydrates. And you want to avoid simple carbohydrates. You want to avoid sugars. That's been a big driver. And people laugh about this and say, oh, come on, sugar couldn't possibly drive cognitive decline. Well, yeah, it can.
Yes.
And of course, pre-diabetes and type 2 diabetes are some of the biggest risk factors. And of course, metabolic syndrome. These things are all absolutely crucial for increasing your risk. And then 12.3, because we want you to fast at least 12 hours between finishing your dinner and starting your breakfast, brunch, or lunch. And then 3 hours at least before bedtime. So with that combination, you want to have, all whole foods from the rainbow. These are all helpful. Of course, polyphenols, those alone have been shown to reduce your risk for cognitive decline. All sorts of good things. Now, I know there's a whole movement about carnivory. Looking at, let's just have, well, and for younger people who are looking for getting rid of autoimmune disease, great, that makes sense. There's never been anything published to show that diet improved cognitive decline. So I'm hoping that the carnivore group will publish such a, please do the research, publish it. That would be great. Again, we're agnostic, whatever helps the most. So far, what has been published repeatedly to be helpful in cognition is a plant-rich, mildly ketogenic, whole foods diet. Typically, we want people to stay away from gluten and dairy. Mm-hmm. Now, some people will also ultimately find that they have to stay away from lectins. Dr. Stephen Gundry has talked a lot about this. Yep. For most of us, that's not a big problem. But for autoimmune situations, that it can be helpful. So you want to adjust things based on your own response. But that's the sort of diet that works best for cognitive decline, and regaining that insulin sensitivity and regaining that non-inflammatory state, just huge.
Yeah. What's interesting is I've kind of adopted my own kind of keto flexitarian diet, because I found that keeping women specifically that had adrenal stuff, thyroid stuff going on, which is many, hardcore staying in ketosis, it eventually caused damage and it wasn't good. So I kind of adopted a more metabolically flexible of training the system to go in and out of ketosis throughout the week. So we do some fasting. We go, some days you'll have a higher carb count, but we're talking sweet potato, some fruit, absolutely. Right? And just so that your body can kind of come in and out of that metabolic flexibility.
And that is metabolic flexibility. And that's we talk about that in the new book.
It's great. Now, interesting. You'll be interested to know this. Over the years of being in practice in nutrition, when I have a client or a member in one of my membership groups that cannot break the insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes, no matter how much she's fasting or how low carb she seems to be going, the one thing that seems to almost 95% of the time that will finally get their blood sugar to normal is carnivore. Isn't that
Yeah.
interesting? And fast, like a month of carnivore where somebody, had these type 2 diabetes or insulin resistance, and keto wasn't getting them out of it. Carnivore pulls them out. I don't think it should be kept for a long time unless, like you said, if they have a really bad autoimmune condition that seems to be a lot better on a carnivore diet, for sure. I think it's got therapeutic value. I had Dr. Sean Baker on here talking about it, and Paul Saladino's great, but for that purpose, actually, I find that it works, but I use it as a therapeutic tool.
Well, again, the armamentarium is large. We're all learning now to apply things appropriately. We're all about the biochemistry. What's going to drive synaptic production and maintenance? And therefore, I'm very skeptical of anyone who says, my way is the only way.
Yeah.
It just, that's not the way human physiology works. And so we find that one of the most helpful things is for people to get feedback, people who can observe and say, oh yeah, I changed this and this was either better or worse.
Yeah.
Then they can slowly move toward an optimal approach. So what we can do is give biochemical guidelines to say, this is what you want to go toward. And then you can check cognition and see who's improving with their cognition and who's not improving with their cognition.
Yeah, because you talk a lot about inflammation being the driving factor. Well, somebody who could be food sensitive to eggs or nightshades, that going just straight keto isn't going to work because they are still eating those foods. And so you got to bring it out in order to lower that inflammation and heal the gut. But I mean, we could keep talking, Dr. Bredesen.
Yeah,
I know, but let's tell people where they can find you. So the book is The End of Alzheimer's. We've got a new one coming out. What's the new one then going to be about?
Well, the new one was actually named by Random House as The End of Alzheimer's Program. So at first I said, I don't like that because it sounds like it's the end of the program. But
right.
The idea here is that the first one was really about, here for the first time we can do this. Here are these wonderful people who've gotten better. The second one, after the first one, people said, well, we'd like some more details. So the second one has more on the details side of here's where you go, here's how you get this, etc. Some of which is in the first book, but there's a little more detail in the second one.
Mm-hmm. What's great about your book is you very clearly, you give the science and you dive deep into it for the people that need that part of it. But then you just completely simplify it and say, here's what you're going to go get from your doctor. Here's where you're going to go online to take this test. And you break it down. Here's what you're going to eat. Here's the supplements that you're going to want to look at. Here's where your hormones should be. And it's so simple because you can just refer to it and go, okay, this is where I'm going to go next. I'm going to go check my heavy metals now. Right here where Dr. Bredesen says to go check it. It's so broken down so simply for any kind of reader to get what you're trying to get across in it. So I think it's a great book. I think you're going to save lives. You are saving lives with it. And I know that many of my listeners are going to be so grateful to have heard you speak and to know this information that there is a way to prevent Alzheimer's. So thank you so much for coming on the show. You can find Dr. Bredesen at drbredesen.com. And what was the other? You had another.
Go to mycognoscopy.com or apollohealthco.com. Any of those will get you there.
Yeah.
And for everyone, please be careful when someone says your test is within normal limits, as everybody's now realizing. Having a homocysteine of 12 is, quote, normal, but it's not optimal. So be careful. We want to get you to optimal, not just to within normal limits.
Yeah, I think that's very important to hear. Even the hemoglobin A1C or blood sugar. Like I've had clients that have gone in and they were 0.1 away from being in the range of insulin resistant. Yeah. And their doctor says, you're fine. I'm like, you're not fine. You're 0.1 away.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah. Optimal.
So, the reality is, we can all reduce the global burden of dementia working together. So let's do that.
All right. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
All right. Thank you, Karen. Thanks for having me.